Growing up, if I learnt anything, it was that nothing in my family was free. I'm not referring to how most parents want their children to take on tasks or perform housework. No, everything was a transaction in my family. I had to demonstrate that I was worthy of the investment if I desired anything. However, for some reason, my younger brother George was always exempt from that same restriction. I initially believed it to be a coincidence. As time passed, I came to see that it was more than just independence. Perhaps I was simply the mature one. It has to do with expectations. My parents anticipated that I would struggle and solve problems on my own. George, though, he was weak. He required assistance. I still recall requesting a new pair of sneakers when I was 10 years old. My mother advised me to save money for my birthday, or perhaps earn it by receiving perfect grades. So I waited. I put a lot of effort into my work. George received brand new footwear 2 weeks later, solely for soccer purposes. You're more responsible with money. You can wait, my mother answered with a smile when I asked why. It always went like that. I missed a deadline once, and my dad suspended me for a week and told me I needed to grow up. Mom consoled George when he forgot an assignment and failed a test, saying, "It happens to everyone." My father chuckled when George was caught drinking at the age of 17, saying, "Boys will be boys." However, I was placed under lockdown for 2 weeks after I returned home 5 minutes past curfew. I never voiced any complaints. For what purpose was it? I had been saving money for a used car through part-time job for over a year by the time I turned 16. I was content with the fact that I knew my parents would not assist me. I believed I was, however. George's 14th birthday was a week before mine. He received a brand new, pricey gaming console from my parents. It didn't matter, I told myself. We'll see about getting you a car in a couple of years once you've proven you can handle the responsibility, my dad remarked, shaking his head when he noticed the expression on my face. I stopped expecting anything from them at that point. I had a job. I came to my rescue. At 17, I purchased my own vehicle. I made the effort to attend college. As soon as I could, I moved out. In the meantime, George abandoned every job he had and left college twice, but my parents always came to his rescue. I never sought assistance, even while I was having trouble, even when I was in need of it. Some foolish part of me believed that maybe, just maybe, now that I was an adult, things would be different, even though I should have cut them off completely. Perhaps now they would see me in a different light. Then my dad texted me last week. Family meeting. Be here Sunday at 3:00 p.m. Don't be late. Our last family meeting had been more than 10 years ago. I nearly disregarded it. I was no longer a child. I didn't reside in their home. However, my curiosity overcame me. So I went. And I felt something was wrong as soon as I entered that house. George appeared bored as he slouched on the couch. He hardly gave me a nod. At the kitchen table, Mom and Dad sat with solemn expressions. A folder was positioned before them. Then my father said something. "Sit down." Yes, I did. There was silence for a minute. My mother then slipped a piece of paper in my direction across the table. To be honest, I had no idea what I was anticipating when I picked it up. However, my stomach fell when I read what was on that paper. It was a bill with specifics, and they meant it. I glanced at the paper in my hands, my eyes skimming the neatly printed rows of expenses. Room and board, groceries, utilities, medical costs. When I was a teenager, they gave me gas money for each ride. The sum was shown at the bottom in bold letters, $79,800. I actually chuckled for a moment, not because it was humorous, but because I honestly believed this had to be a joke. I said, putting the paper down, "You're kidding." They didn't both laugh. My dad answered, "We're not," in a cool, almost patient tone, as if he were telling a youngster something that was clear. "The cost of raising a child is high. We provided you with food, shelter, and education. It's time to start giving back now that you've achieved success." I blinked. The sheer craziness of what I was hearing was making my thoughts race. My mother then added, her tone softer but no less forceful, "We're just charging you this amount, so be thankful." The sum would be much larger if we included everything. I glanced at George, half expecting him to roll his eyes at this absurdity, half expecting him to make a joke. Rather, he simply shrugged, as if this were all too commonplace. I gave a headshake. You're not kidding. Dad's tolerance was obviously wearing thin as he exhaled through his nostrils. For yourself, you're doing well. You lead a fulfilling life and operate your own company. In the meantime, we helped you for decades. Now that you are in a position to assist, that is the least you can do. A burning, bitter sensation swelled in my throat. I answered slowly, in a calm but piercing voice. You didn't support me. I worked. I was self-sufficient in my education. As soon as I could, I moved out. Never once have I requested money from you. Dad's face grew serious. And for that reason, we were confident that you could manage this. That's when it finally clicked. They didn't believe they were requesting this sum of money. They really thought I owed them, as if I were an investment they were finally making money on. I glanced over the itemized list and then down to the invoice once again. There were several ridiculous parts, including general parenting costs, $20,000. However, there was something toward the bottom that truly chilled me. Loan to cover family emergencies, $115,000. I scowled. What is this? I gestured toward the line item. Mom moved around in her chair. We needed money at that time a few years back. Remember how you paid off part of the mortgage? Oh, I recalled. They had called me unexpectedly, in a panic, and said they were having trouble and only needed a little assistance. That day I had sent them the money. Without hesitation, I stated. It wasn't a loan. Now my voice was uncannily quiet. I handed you that sum of money. I never requested its return. Dad dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Well, that proves you had a lot of money to spare. I clenched my fingers over the paper's edges. Let me clarify this, I remarked in a hushed voice. Every parent has a moral and legal obligation to provide for their child, and I'm expected to reimburse you for those things. But when I give you my money without ever asking for it back, it's just gone? Mom sighed, as if I were exaggerating. Honey, you're not understanding. The money isn't the point. It has to do with gratitude. This is merely a method for you to express your gratitude for everything we have done for you. We have worked hard to provide you with a decent existence. I nearly burst out laughing once more. However, it was devoid of comedy. Thank you. For what purpose? For the years that you were viewed as a financial liability while George was given everything. For reminding me all the time that I had to work for what he had for free. I had lived my whole life attempting to establish my value on par with his. I eventually came to terms with the reality while I was sitting in the kitchen, looking at that absurd invoice. I would never be. I slipped the paper back across the table after taking a deep breath. No. Dad's mouth tightened. Pardon me? No, I said again, getting to my feet. I won't pay you. Mom's expression tightened. Your parents are us. We took care of you for years. The least you can do is this. I laughed a little dryly. I was a child. You decided to have me. You have no right to charge me for simply being here. Mom's face flushed as her mouth moved back and forth. But Dad did nothing but sit back and observe me with barely veiled dismay. He whispered, We always knew you were selfish. Something broke inside of me. Selfish? Me. I carefully retrieved my phone from my pocket. After a little period of scrolling, I swung the screen in their direction. They glanced in its direction. Mom scowled. What is this? I grinned. I see. My own bill. Quiet. Heavy quiet. Thick and oppressive. My mother's lips pressed into a narrow line as her gaze darted across my phone's screen. After giving it a fleeting inspection, my dad shook his head. His voice was clipped as he stated, This is different. I arched an eyebrow. How? Mom moved apprehensively. Because we're your parents, she began, struggling to find the right words. We used the funds we plundered from you to provide for the family. You weren't having any trouble. You had plenty. I let out a strong breath through my nostrils. Incredibly so. I said, So let me get this straight. in a cool but direct tone. When you spend money on me on things that every parent is legally required to provide, it's a debt I have to repay. I pointed to the ridiculous list of expenses they had painstakingly compiled on the invoice they had given me. But when I give you cash, you simply take it away without ever asking for it back. Dad's face grew serious. Be mindful of your tone. I paid him no attention, I went on, my voice firm. I was 18 when you took that inheritance. You informed me that Grandpa had left me nothing. However, I later learned that he had. Mom winced. She must have understood it wouldn't work, because she opened her mouth as if to deny it. Rather, she looked to her father, as if he may be able to help. Dad rubbed his temple and let out a quick exhale. It headed for the home, mortgage installments, upkeep, things that were advantageous to you. I laughed without a sense of humor. Gained an advantage? I shook my head and repeated. I left home at 19. None of that money was visible to me. But you're saying that I gained something from it? Neither of them responded. Then George said something for the first time since I had come. Why are you handling this so badly? He inquired, sounding irritated as usual, as if I were the one who was exaggerating. You're not exactly broke. I pivoted and gazed upon him. Observe him closely. He was wearing a hoodie that I was positive Mom had purchased for him, and he was relaxing in his chair with his arms crossed. He continued to reside at home. He continued to drive an automobile that my parents had purchased. They continued to give him handouts when he needed them. He didn't see the issue, of course. I inhaled deeply while trying to maintain my composure. I answered calmly, George, this isn't about the money. It's because they believe they should be compensated for being the least involved parents. The absolute minimum? Mom reiterated, appearing truly offended. We gave it our all for you. We put a lot of effort into making sure you had food, clothing, and a roof over your head. I extended a hand. Just stop there. She did. Are you able to hear yourself? I shook my head and asked. You're enumerating fundamental parental duties as though they were a luxury. Despite her face flushing, Mom remained silent. I went on. I never asked to be born. I never signed a contract requiring me to reimburse you for rearing me. It was your responsibility. You decided to have children. It was your duty. Dad's mouth clenched. In a chilly, quiet voice, he remarked, You act like we're just strangers to you. I looked him in the eye and spoke clearly and steadily. Aren't you? Since a true parent wouldn't be sitting here attempting to coerce their child into giving them money. For the first time, Mom's face broke. Not into regret or shame, but into hurt. As if I were the one who had betrayed them, as if I were the self-centered one. She shook her head and muttered, You've changed. You've been acting like you're too good for this family ever since you moved out. Something flickered through me, anguish, frustration, possibly even loss. However, I suppressed it. Observe, he said. You don't wish to cover the entire cost? All right, we are able to bargain. I blinked. Make a deal? He gave a nod, as though we were negotiating a bargain. He went on. If you at least contribute something, I'm willing to lower the total. That's when I came to another realization. They were surprised when I retaliated, either out of shame or because I didn't want to make a disturbance. They had believed I would just pay. Perhaps they believed that I was still the child who worked hard and kept his head down, while George coasted through life, receiving everything at his fingertips. However, I was no longer that child. I inhaled deeply, stood up straight, and looked directly into my father's eyes. I declared, I'm not negotiating. I'm not spending a dime. The chamber was thick and heavy with silence. With his fingers gripping the edge of the table, my father's jaw tightened and his knuckles turned white. My mother's lips became a thin, quivering line, as if she were about to cry. George muttered something, but I wasn't interested enough to inquire. I picked up my phone from the table and got to my feet. This discussion is over. With a steady heartbeat and measured breathing, I turned to face the door. I thought they would let me go, maybe yell at me, maybe make me feel bad one last time, but let me go. However, my father's voice interrupted me as I was about to grab the doorknob. "You're cutting yourself off from this family if you walk out that door," he warned in a low, foreboding voice. I paused. Not because I was changing my mind. However, I became aware of how familiar this situation seemed. They had always manipulated me in this way, by giving me the impression that I had to prove myself, to be a member of the family, by giving me the impression that I wouldn't fit in if I didn't follow their rules. However, the reality was I had previously spent years living alone. I glanced over my shoulder, turning my head just enough. I believe that was already known by both of us a long time ago. I then let the door click shut behind me and went outdoors. I reached for the door handle and went steadily to my car, my hands not even trembling. I had anticipated feeling something, perhaps even remorse, rage, or despair. However, I didn't. I had no feelings. Don't worry. I have no regrets. Simply put, relief. For a short while, I sat in the driver's seat with my fingers encircling the steering wheel and again rehearsing the conversation in my head. My phone then sprang to life. "Mom is calling." I waited for the screen to go dark while I watched it. There was a voicemail notice. I didn't pay attention to it. It would say something I already knew. A combination of guilt tripping and rage, the same pattern they had always followed. Dad sent me an SMS a second later. "You have till the month's end to change your mind. Don't abandon your family because of this," I sneered. I threw my phone on the front seat, started the engine. I had already decided what to do, and there was no turning back this time. It was 3 days later. It was the first time I had not returned any calls or messages. My mother, father, and even George initially arrived in waves, each alternating between anger and guilt tripping. However, the calls decreased on the third day. The texts became shorter. Finally, they came to a halt. Perhaps they had finally given up, I thought. I ought to have been more aware. As I was finishing up that Friday afternoon, I saw a text message from George on my phone. "You're acting absurdly. Simply give them money and go on." After a lengthy minute of staring at the message, I turned my phone face down on my desk. He would say that, of course, because it wouldn't make a difference to him to pay them off. Giving them even a small portion of what they want would only pave the way for future demands. Closure was not what they desired. They desired authority. I refused to give it to them. I spent that evening looking through old bank documents while seated at my kitchen table. Text messages, transfers, and withdrawals, all the times my parents had embezzled money from me while claiming it was temporary or for the family. Then I discovered it. The inheritance. $115,000 was deposited directly into my parents' account under the heading of temporary help. A few days later, my mother sent me this message. "Thank you so lot. We'll reimburse you shortly. I adore you. 8 years have passed since then." They never mentioned it again. No compensation. No reference to a loan. Just silence. Abruptly, I realized, cutting them off wasn't the only thing at stake. Making sure they never attempted anything similar again was the goal. I opened my laptop and began putting everything in its proper place. Bank records, records of transactions, screenshots of messages. After finishing, I gave the folder a straightforward yet impactful new name: Family Finances. And then I called for the first time in years. The third ring was taken up by my uncle. Uncle Ray said, "Hey kid," in a kind but wary tone. A long time has passed. It had. He was the only member of my extended family who had ever treated me fairly, even if we weren't very close. More significantly, he was my mother's older brother and had served as my grandfather's estate executor in the past. I inhaled. "I want to ask you a quick question regarding Grandpa's will." A pause occurred, then a sigh. I wanted to know when you would ask. My stomach grew constricted. Thus, he was aware. "Not all of it," he acknowledged. "However, I was aware that your parents had stolen the legacy that was intended for you. George and you both received the same amount from your grandfather. However, your mother informed me that you had consented to allow them to handle your portion when I questioned her about it." I laughed resentfully. Control? It was not managed by them. They took it, I responded sharply. That money was supposed to be mine, Uncle Ray replied. I understand. After a little pause, he said, Do you want to do anything about it? I paused. I was certain, not because I wasn't sure. However, hearing it stated so clearly gave it a sense of reality. Do you think I can help? One more pause. Then he answered, Actually, yeah, in a hushed tone. There may be. My heart was racing. I could apparently still pursue the inheritance because it had been intended for me expressly, and I had never formally signed away my rights to it. It would be difficult. I would require legal counsel. However, I had proof that they had taken and spent the money without my consent. It might present a convincing argument. After thanking Uncle Ray, I hung up and spent a considerable amount of time staring at my computer screen. I then did something that I hadn't done in a long time. I gave a lawyer a call. The consultation went quickly. Someone who had previously handled estate disputes, a friend of a friend. I sent him all I owned, the bank records, the previous messages, the evidence that someone had stolen my inheritance without my knowledge. He looked it over, and his answer was straightforward. You have a case. The process of filing everything takes several weeks. I didn't answer my parents' calls in the interim. George's passive-aggressive texts went unnoticed by me. I allowed them to remain in their preconceptions, presumably believing that I had just moved on. The legal notification was then delivered. The actual mayhem began at that point. My mother was the source of the initial explosion. The sharp, unrelenting hammering on my door began just as I was getting home from work. Before I even looked through the peephole, I knew who it was. I opened the door after taking a big breath to prepare myself. She cried out as soon as she spotted me. How could you do this to your own family? Her breathing was labored, as though she had been screaming long before she had arrived, and her face was flushed with rage. I didn't wince. I didn't respond. I simply gazed at her. I'm just taking back what's mine, I said after that. As though I had just given her a slap, she gasped. Yours, she spat. You were reared by us. We looked after you. Our family was the beneficiary of that money. I folded my arms. No, it went to George and you. Then my dad called. He took a different tack, managed, measured. He cautioned, You don't want to do this. His calm, quiet voice sounded almost menacing. However, I did. Then George arrived. You're truly crazy, his text said. This family is being torn apart by you over money. I didn't bother to answer. Because of the following, it was not me who had shattered this family. Indeed, they were. They were the ones who had deceived me, stolen from me, and then attempted to demand more money from me. All I had done was at last assert my own rights. However, they were suddenly dealing with actual repercussions for the first time in their lives, and they were at a loss on what to do. We reached a settlement in court. They had to sell off possessions, including their priceless vacation timeshare, since they lacked the funds to reimburse me. George was enraged. His luxurious existence was impacted for the first time, and for that, he detested me. Naturally, they attempted to blame me and make me the bad guy. However, manipulation only works if you are concerned about the other person's opinion. And I stopped caring. The ensuing hush was deafening. No more phone calls, no more text messages, no more last-ditch efforts to guilt-trip me into compliance. My parents eventually ceased attempting to contact me following the settlement. I initially thought I would feel relieved, and I did. There was something else underneath that relief, though: emptiness. The requirements, issues, and expectations have dominated my existence for years. And now? It was only me now. There were no responsibilities for the first time. I'm not being drained. I'm not being treated like a walking ATM. Nothing but quiet. And for a long time, that silence haunted me with all I had lost, like a ghost. Then, however, something occurred. I began to fill the void with important things. I pushed myself into my work because I finally had the energy to create something for myself. Not because I had to. I finally took the vacation I had been putting off, spending 2 weeks in Italy, strolling through Florence's streets, enjoying a glass of wine on a peaceful balcony. and watching the sunset without having to worry about any unpaid bills. Having never had the time, I had always wanted to go hiking, so I started doing it on the weekends. I met Alex on the trail one day. He only wanted to walk with me and didn't require me to make their lives better. The emptiness gradually diminished, and tranquility established itself in its stead. I still occasionally thought about my family. I pondered whether my parents ever felt remorse for their decisions. If George had taken anything away from the incident, if my mother ever considered the true cost of her avarice when gazing at the vacant area where the timeshare once stood. But I knew the truth in my heart. Nothing was going to change, and quitting waiting for them to was the smartest move I've ever done. Months later, one evening, I heard someone knock on my door. Aunt Daisy was standing there with 2 warm mugs of coffee when I opened it. Without a word, she went inside and held me hard. She muttered, "I'm proud of you," with tears in her eyes. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." And I believed her for the first time in my life, because I had made my own decision for the first time. George had inherited everything from my parents. However, I had received something much more important from them: liberty. And I was happier than ever before.